A drastically different setup due to a power outage is not going to stop me from doing a chapter 25-26 Wombo combo video. So, let's get right into the 50s and 60s. Beginning with Eisenhower. So, getting into the Cold War, Eisenhower is kind of thinking, well, shit, now we've got a bunch of nuclear weapons, and I'm not quite sure how we're gonna deal with this. And he proposed the Atoms for Peace plan, where everybody would turn over all of their nukes to some international agency that would deal with it for them, except nobody trusted anybody else, and so that failed essentially instantly. And so instead, what happened was the Secretary of State, Mr. John Foster Dulles, made up the policy of massive retaliation, so that if the Russians were to move anywhere outside their sphere of influence, then the United States would be immediately willing to respond with nukes. And also, in any other case, they would respond with stuff like the Berlin airlift. The second element of Eisenhower's foreign policy was the CIA, otherwise known as the Overthrowing Countries Incorporated, or Country Insurgency Agency. I don't know, you choose. And so, the CIA was able to overthrow governments in Iran and Guatemala, and also found itself caught up with some issues in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and also, just some other places, like Laos and the Congo, and also Cuba. But we'll get to Cuba later, because that's not in the 50s. Next thing that happened after the French got their asses kicked out of Vietnam and North Vietnam and South Vietnam were created, Chiang Kai-shek's national government in China got booted off to Taiwan, which was then known as Formosa. And then the communist government of China started being like, get the fuck out of here. And then the nationalists went out to the U.S. and went like, hey, can you help us? We're not communists. And then the U.S. was like, well, we also don't want to fight China. So, yeah. And eventually, both sides went like, fuck it, we're tired of this. And Taiwan became Taiwan, which currently still is in a weird spot. Yeah. Also, then in July 1955, Eisenhower met in Geneva with Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin died. And then he went like, hey, Stalin was an asshole tyrant, torturing people, fucking crazy, it's time to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union. And so, everybody outside of the Soviet Union, like, yay, they're not going to be so communist. And all the diehard communists were like, no, we're not going to be so communist. Fuck. But, yeah. And despite of all this, conflicts are continuing to spread because this is the Cold War. Including that time Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Arab ruler of Egypt, went like, hey, I want some help to build this Aswan High Dam. And then he went to both the US and the Soviet Union, which pissed them both off. And they were like, what the fuck? And Dulles canceled the United States loan. And then Nasser took the Suez Canal, which was owned by the British and French at the current. And he wanted to basically nationalize the canal. And the British or French were like, no, that's like some of the only remaining vestiges of our colonial power. Stop it. And so, with the British and French backing them, Israel attacked Egypt. And then Eisenhower was like, what the fuck? And immediately sponsored a UN resolution demanding the Israelites back the fuck off. And for a strange moment there, the United States and the USSR were both against Britain, France, and Israel, the United States' normal allies. And eventually, the United States threatened to send troops against the British and Israelites in Egypt because they were kind of, fucking shit up. And eventually, there's a ceasefire, and the canal was reopened under Egyptian management. And also, the British Prime Minister resigned. Because, Also, Hungary tried to have a democratic revolution, but that failed because the Americans weren't going to be able to support that shit. too far inside the Soviet territory. Oof. And then the then the USSR launched Sputnik, and so we started a space race. And even though we had more missile technologies, the rest of the US is going like, but they launched something into space. Like, we didn't launch anything into space. And so then the administration went like, fine, and we made NASA, and then we made the National Defense Education Act, which just provided STEM education for kiddos so that we could have scientists that could build us rockets to go into space. And so, with that and the GI Bill, more and more people are graduating and getting into college. Crazy. Then we had another Geneva conference. The spirit of the former Geneva conference was like, hey, let's like be nice. But then we kind of crashed a reconnaissance plane, and the pilot survived and revealed he was a U.S. pilot spying, and we got caught spying, and we didn't really have a friendly existence with them for the next couple years. But then, after Eisenhower, we've got Vice President Nixon, who was said to have not really done much, according to Eisenhower, versus JFK. And of course JFK won, because he was, he had vigor. And he was, he was young, he had ideals, he went like, alright, we're gonna close the missile gap that technically didn't exist, and I'm definitely a World War II hero, and fuck yeah, bitches, let's go. And so we got JFK now. And also, we're gonna take a break from politics and we're gonna talk about culture. This is A-Push. This ain't WAP. Are you crazy? So, first off, television. It's a thing now. And people watch it because there's nothing else to do in their boring ass lives. Stuff including, news and the adventures of Hossie and Harriet. It was kind of boring if you ask me. But there was also quiz shows, which already were rocked by scandals of cheating, because, can't wait until you start cheating. And the Ed Sullivan Show, where the guy introduced Elvis Presley to the world, and then later the Beatles. It was TV, alright? It's pretty massive. And also, the car. That's a thing now. And it was also helped along by the interstate highway system, which let you go anywhere. Crazy. And so new industries sprang up around the car, which was now like essential. Fast food restaurants, insurance, gas, tires, all sorts of shit is now popping up. Because cars. Oh, and there's also a religious boom, because people just felt like being religious now. That was the thing. Especially because of this guy named Billy Graham, who just held revivals everywhere and went like, alright, bitches, religion. And even Catholics and Jews and African communities were starting to boost in their religion. With Catholics just like getting more active, Jews trying to rediscover their faith, and even this guy named Elijah Muhammad, who built up the Nation of Islam for the African Americans. And also because in the Cold War we saw the USSR as a bunch of atheists, and we wanted to be not godless atheists. That was kind of the war. We're religious. We have a god. They're atheists. They don't. They're bad. And so this is what led to stuff like adding the phrase one nation under God and adding the words in God we trust to dollars. So yeah. But the 50s were also the beginning of civil rights descent, which would continue on into the 60s, which we will talk about, including, including a civil Catholic worker movement started by a person named Dorothy Day. You got Elvis Presley, rocking in with rock and roll. And you have this guy named Alfred Kinsey who wrote the books Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and the Human Female, which basically just said that's exactly what's on the tin. And then it gave everybody the impression of, well, I mean, it's bad, but if other people are doing it, is it really that bad? Playboy was started, by the way. Yeah. Also a bunch of literature shit. Catcher in the Rye, Howl, On the Road, counterculture starting to come up with the Beat Generation. You can look up the Beat Generation on the internet. I'm not here to preach literary culture. Oh yeah, Brown versus the Board of Education happened. Woo, desegregation. And also, Little Rock 9 had to be protected by the National Guard whenever Alabama kept being Alabama and went like, but no, I keep segregation. This is one of the more important. Okay, well, there goes my flashlight. This is one of the more important rulings of the Warren Court, which also ruled on stuff like Miranda v. Arizona and Gideon versus Wainwright, and Yates versus the United States, and some other stuff. Pretty important cases. With Miranda versus Arizona being about, hey, you have the right to have counsel with you during interrogations, and Gideon v. Wainwright saying, hey, if you don't got a lawyer, the court has to provide you with a lawyer, which led to public defenders. Yeah. And also in Montgomery, Rosa Parks did her thing. Yeah. Sat down in a bus. Yep. NAACP, MLK, civil rights is starting up again. And they would have... And in Montgomery, all of the African Americans had a year-long bus boycott, which eventually led to the desegregation of buses in Montgomery. That was pretty cool. And also, there is a Southern Christian Leadership Conference created, which would be a major leader in the civil rights movement. Students would also be major in the civil rights movement, doing stuff like sit-in protest, freedom rides on buses, and all sorts of other shit. Yeah. Just civil rights is doing a thing. There's a march on Washington. MLK had his I Have a Dream speech. There's a student nonviolent coordinating committee that, help register people to vote and stuff in freedom summers. Malcolm X did it and became popular. This is late 1960s. We're in the 60s already. Hold up. We're in the 60s. Okay. So now we're in the 60s. And now we're also getting into more civil rights movement stuff. Hooray! And there's also the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that would challenge the all-white Mississippi delegation in the Democratic Convention, both in 64 and 68, which was the most riotous one ever. And Malcolm X, unlike MLK, who promoted nonviolence, went like, hey, how about we fight back? Question mark? But yeah. Now then, this is the point. 1425? Alright, I'll save that. But right now, we're gonna get into the 60s. Craziness. I gotta breathe. Anyways. So, books, film, music. Pop culture is starting to become more and more counterculture. Rock and roll is becoming more and more of a thing with people. But normal life was still very much celebrated with stuff like The Sound of Music. but also films like Bonnie and Clyde, The Wild Bunch, Easy Rider, rock and roll songs from the likes of Jimi Hendrix, Pink Floyd, and Grateful Dead. It's all changing how people enjoyed their entertainment and what messages those entertainment presented. Oh yeah, and in the 60s, students are definitely a protest thing. Like, you thought that... Actually, wait. So, man, I need to stop and think about this. Yeah, essentially, right now you have the March for Our Lives, and you have the massive student protest stuff going on. And so these movements in the 60s were rather similar to that. Universities all over, especially the university at Berkeley, were starting to have more and bigger student protest groups, protesting for, downfall of bureaucracy, oh no, democracy is fake, the government's stupid, stuff like that. Not really. There's actually legitimate criticism. I just can't think of it right now. But the current climate had given many people the feeling that things aren't going so well, and we need to protest that. Which led to stuff like the time where everybody surrounded a police car so it couldn't leave, and then proceeded to make speeches on top of that police car. So yeah. Kennedy would try to make a new frontier before he died, and he was trying to have some domestic change, but he didn't really do all too much. He did make a mental health act. He didn't really do much. And, however, the Supreme Court was doing plenty. This was the Warren Court. It's a liberal as fuck court, dude. Including Engel versus Vitale, which said you can't make school prayers by the government. No religion in government. And then later it'd say, just nah. In the Emmington School Board v. Schmepp, they went like, nah. No matter who makes the prayers, you can't have prayers or readings of scriptures because that's unconstitutional. Everybody got a right to their own religion. That's it. And, people were going crazy because America is mostly Christian. And so they're going like, what? What are you doing, Supreme Court? But, you're just trying to protect everybody's rights. That's how they roll. And Kennedy was definitely, by the way, more of a Cold War warrior kind of guy. He was all up in foreign policy, as opposed to LBJ later on, after, Kennedy dies. And so, he would first have to deal with the Bay of Pigs, where he sponsored a CIA invasion that failed. Sucks. Also, the US looks pretty stupid now. Also sucks. Then Khrushchev creates a wall in Berlin, which also sucks, but he didn't try to prevent access or anything, so it was just kind of there. And you had tanks facing off at one point, but nothing really happened except that, now there's a wall in Berlin. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis started whenever we realized, hey, wait a second, Cuba's communist and... those are... Hey, let me pull up my binoculars. Those are Russian ships? And so, the Russians are putting missiles in Cuba. And so, Kennedy gets together an executive committee. They all get together and be like, alright, we can't just attack Cuba, but we do have to deal with this shit. And so, Kennedy went to Khrushchev and went like, hey, fucker, we're putting a quarantine on Cuba. It's not a blockade, because we're not going to war, but if you send any ships down, we gonna fire on you, so you better not. And so, after a lot of staring at each other fiercely, eventually, through some diplomatic work, Kennedy and Khrushchev came to an agreement. Khrushchev would take missiles out of Cuba, and the US would take missiles out of Turkey. And tensions went down a little bit. I can hardly see this book. You're going to have to give me a moment. But along with this Cold War warrior business and his new flexible response policy, where they would, have escalating responses to the different escalating actions, as opposed to just, we're gonna nuke anything that moves policy. He also created the Peace Corps, where young volunteers would go out into the world to help poor people, because we're definitely on a moral high ground. Haha. And then he got shot in the face. Now, we're gonna deal with LBJ, and he wants to do, domestic changes, as opposed to foreign policy changes. Except for Vietnam, but we'll get there. So, he starts a war on poverty, and wants to start the Great Society. Because, as a guy who was raised poor, instead of Kennedy, who was raised rich, he sympathized, and he wanted to make some good changes. And he kind of wanted to have the same kind of deal as FDR's New Deal. But he wanted it called the Great Society. And so, he had, and not only that, he had great legislative skills. He was able to push a bill through Congress, because he knew where the skeletons were hiding in which closets, and where the closets were, and where to pull the strings. He knew Congress better than Congress knew itself. And so he passed a great many things, including a civil rights bill, a voting act rights bill, a water quality bill, and he also created a Volunteers in Service to America, which was a domestic Peace Corps, essentially, and a neighborhood youth corps to give jobs to poor youth. And, it's pretty crazy. After he was elected over Barry Goldwater, he kept on moving along, creating the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which would increase education, Medicare and Medicaid, which would give medical insurance to many Americans and let people see doctors, the Immigration Act of 1965, which abolished old immigration quotas and said, hey, you got family outside the United States, you can bring them inside the United States. Wow! And with the demonstrations in Selma and the Bloody Sunday that followed, LBJ went up, he made a speech, went like, and we shall overcome. Which is pretty crazy, Guy from the South, Civil War, Confederate states saying, hey, civil rights. So, yeah. And then he made a Voting Rights Act. So, whole lot of domestic changes. It's pretty crazy. However, then we got into Vietnam, which wasn't very fun. We essentially just started sending men to Vietnam because we were like, oh no, if Vietnam falls to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia will fall into communism. Domino theory. And then after a Gulf of Tonkin revolution, we essentially just went to war in Vietnam, continually escalating and then continually losing men to what continually would seem like a stalemate. So yeah. It was pretty bad. And eventually, there was a whole lot of protesters to the Vietnam War, led by many of the times students in all those universities that I mentioned earlier, and also a whole lot of other people who went like, fuck off, I don't want to be in this war, this is stupid. And so, by the time LBJ's leaving office, he's like, fuck it, I'm out. I'm not even gonna run for re-election. This is not gonna work. Because he was losing popularity little by little. Yeah. Also, MLK dies. He got assassinated. And then Robert Kennedy dies. He got shot. So, 1968 was the time where everybody dies. And then the Democratic Convention, they pick somebody for re-election, was basically gassed by the police, and then all the demonstrators and protesters, of which there were way too many, were basically beat up on the streets in front of television cameras. So yeah, that gave a pretty good case for Richard Nixon to win with a unified Republican Party. So yeah. And now we're through the 50s and 60s. Sorry for the slightly disjointed audio. I'm currently sitting in a dark room, and then my flashlight went out about halfway through the recording. But I'm fairly sure we got through most of it. Good luck!